Welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to look at the inner matter or interstellar matter, the stuff that's in between the stars. And a lot of people would think that there is a vacuum in space, that there's no matter at all. But there is some dust, there is some gas, mostly hydrogen gas, that exists in these long distances between stars and galaxies. So there's several types of material that we're going to talk about, and it's using a Latin word, of course, and that is nebula. Nebula just means cloud. So when you look at this region of space that is not, there's no star there, but there is material. It looks like smoke. It looks like smoke in the sky. You're going to see that that's named nebula. And then there's various types of nebula. So there are bright nebula, okay, which appears to be bright, and then the background behind the dust would be black. So you have a dark background with some kind of a bright material in front. The thing I could think of would be a nice blue sky and a white fluffy cloud, where there's either something reflected from that cloud or glowing out of that cloud that would allow it to stick out as bright, and then the background would be dark. So that would be called a bright nebula. And then the dark nebula is exactly its opposite. It's going to appear dark, and then a background will be lighter. Okay, so something like a storm cloud, where it appears very dark, and then behind it would be a bright sky. Okay, so you're going to see that these nebula essentially are gases, mostly hydrogen, and a little bit of very fine dust, whatever that dust would be made out of. And so we'll look at that in this lesson. Continuing, there's a couple different types of bright nebula. So just to remind you, a bright nebula is something close enough to a star that it will usually glow. Okay, so there's a couple different possibilities. The first one is an emission nebula. And what's happening is light from the star that's in the ultraviolet range. Remember, UV light would be what would cause suntans or sunburns for us. So it's coming from the sun to us just like visible light, just like heat is coming from the sun. So it's just one of the electromagnetic radiation sections of the spectrum. But if this UV light goes into this cloud, if the cloud is under low enough pressure, then what actually happens is it kind of steals a little bit of the energy. So UV is greater than light, so it's a higher energy, shorter wavelength than light. When it is absorbed by this gas, some of the energy is absorbed, and it basically sucks a little bit of the power out of this UV light and turns it into light. So it steals enough energy to steal like the purples and the greens and the oranges, and then it emits light in the red lane, so the red zone of visible light. So when you look at this, it appears red, okay? And where the energy is coming from is not itself, but it's essentially absorbing energy from a nearby very hot blue star, using some of that energy as it expands or heats up, and then emits a red light. So one of them is called emission. The second kind of bright nebula, which also glows, is reflection. And so maybe I shouldn't say glow. It's acting like a mirror. So if you were to have fireworks, if you've ever seen fireworks on the 4th of July and you've got a dark sky, but lots of smoke in the sky because you've had lots and lots of fireworks, light can reflect off of that smoke. It actually acts like a movie screen. So any light in the neighborhood can bounce off of that smoke and then come back at you. And that's what's happening with reflection nebula. It's appearing blue, but really it's just reflecting the blue light of nearby hot stars. So that's another bright nebula. So we had two. You had Emission Nebula, which glowed red as it absorbed energy and then actually emitting light. In this case, it's just reflecting light. Another type of nebulae, and nebulae is just the plural for nebula. You're going to learn Latin, I guess, this year, but it's planetary nebulae. Planetary, I'm not exactly sure why they call it planetary. It's not a planet. It's actually a star that as it runs out of fuel, let's imagine a star which is mostly hydrogen, is fusing that hydrogen together into helium, and that's what it does. As it forces it under high pressure and heat, it releases tremendous amounts of energy. As all of the hydrogen runs out, it has to kind of press helium together, which is harder. It takes more energy to do that. Eventually, it runs out of material. And as it's running out of material, it's actually emitting a gas of basically a nebula. It's dust. It's gases that are emitting from a dying star or a dead star. And this nebula that used to be the material that was inside a star looks like a huge giant planet. And I think that's why they call it a planetary nebula, not because it comes from a planet, but because it resembles a planet as it's essentially being shed from a dying or dead star. The last type of nebula is called dark nebula. And dark nebula only because when you look at it through a telescope or even a set of binoculars, depending on how close it is, it appears dark and the background appears light. Okay, so normally there's not enough stars in the neighborhood to either bounce off of it or have it absorb those energy waves. And so when you see it, if there are stars behind it bright enough, then you can see the gases because it stands out as a dark object rather than a light object.